Officer James Carter was not just any police officer. In the small town where he lived, almost everyone knew his name. He had been serving the community for more than 10 years, and people trusted him. Whenever there was trouble, they knew James would show up, not only to do his duty, but to listen, to help, and to comfort. Unlike some officers who just came, did their job, and left, James cared about the people he protected. He remembered faces, names, and even small details about people's lives. He would stop to check on the elderly, play ball with kids in the park, and help struggling shopkeepers carry boxes when no one else was around. James lived a simple life. He didn't have a big house, expensive cars, or fancy clothes. He lived alone in a small home near the station, and most of his free time was spent helping in the community. Some nights, he volunteered at the local shelter, making sure people had blankets and food. Other times, he visited the hospital to cheer up sick children. He believed that wearing a police uniform was not just about catching criminals, it was about protecting hope, trust, and kindness. People often asked him why he wasn't married or why he didn't have children. James would just smile and say, "I guess my family is the whole town." Deep inside, he did dream of having kids one day, but life had not given him that chance yet. He had been through heartbreaks, and sometimes he wondered if he was meant to be a father. Still, his heart was big enough to love and care for everyone who crossed his path. There was something different about James, a gentleness that people noticed right away. Children liked him because he never spoke down to them. He treated them with respect, listened to their stories, and laughed at their jokes. Old people liked him because he was patient and never rushed them. Even people who had been in trouble with the law found it hard to dislike him. He believed in second chances, and he often said, "No one is too broken to be fixed." It wasn't that James had an easy life. In fact, he had grown up in a poor neighborhood himself. He knew what it felt like to be cold in the winter and hungry at night. His father had passed away when he was just a boy, and his mother worked 2 jobs to raise him and his younger sister. That's why he understood struggle so well. His own childhood made him sensitive to the pain of others. One winter evening, as he was finishing his shift, he saw a young boy sitting on the sidewalk, shivering in the cold. The boy was holding a cardboard sign that said, "Hungry." James could have simply called child services, but instead, he took the boy to a nearby diner, bought him a warm meal, and stayed with him until help arrived. That's the kind of man he was always willing to go the extra mile, even if no one was watching. Over the years, James had seen a lot of sadness in his job, broken families, abandoned children, and people who had lost everything. Case left a small mark on his heart. Some officers learned to ignore it, but James never could. He carried those memories with him, and they shaped the way he saw the world. He believed that if you had the power to help someone, you should do it without hesitation. His fellow officers respected him, but they also teased him for being too soft. They said he cared too much, but James didn't mind. To him, caring was not a weakness. It was the strongest thing a person could do. He once told a rookie officer, "One day you'll understand that sometimes the greatest act of bravery is showing kindness in a world that can be so cold." James didn't know it then, but all the kindness and compassion he had been giving to others for years was leading him toward the biggest decision of his life, a decision that would change not only his future, but the futures of 6 little girls who had no one else in the world. Even before meeting them, James's life had been building toward that moment. Every act of kindness, every person he helped, and every sacrifice he made was preparing his heart for something much bigger. He was a man ready to love, ready to protect, and ready to fight for those who needed him most. And when fate brought those 6 unwanted girls into his path, James Carter's true calling as more than just a police officer, but as a father would finally be revealed. It was a freezing winter night. The kind of night when the wind felt like tiny knives against the skin. Most people were already home, wrapped in blankets with hot drinks in their hands. But Officer James Carter was still out on patrol. He drove slowly through the quiet streets, headlights cutting through the falling snow, making sure everyone in his small town was safe as he turned down a narrow, poorly lit alley behind an old factory. Something caught his attention, a faint movement near the corner of an abandoned building. At first, he thought it might be a stray dog looking for food or shelter. But as he parked his car and stepped out, he heard the sound of muffled sobs. His heart tightened. James approached carefully, his boots crunching in the snow. That's when he saw them. 6 small figures huddled together, wrapped in thin, torn blankets. Their faces were pale, their lips trembling, and their eyes wide with fear. They looked like they hadn't eaten in days. The oldest girl, maybe around 12, clutched the youngest, who couldn't have been more than 2, against her chest. Trying to shield her from the cold dot, James knelt down so he wouldn't scare them. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice calm and warm. "It's okay. You're safe now. My name's James. I'm here to help you." The girls didn't answer. They just stared at him, unsure if they could trust a man in a police uniform. Life had taught them that adults didn't always mean safety. Some of the girls had bruises. All of them had eyes that seemed too old for their young faces, the kind of eyes that had seen too much pain. After a moment, the oldest girl whispered, We don't have anywhere to go." Her voice was shaking, both from fear and from the bitter cold. James felt a lump in his throat. He had seen abandoned children before, but never like this. Not 6 sisters together, trying to survive the winter alone. He asked where their parents were, and the girl shook her head. "They don't want us," she said quietly. Those words hit him harder than any punch he'd ever taken in his career. He radioed for backup, asking for medical help and blankets. As they waited, James stayed with the girls, kneeling in the snow, trying to keep them calm. He told them silly stories about his clumsy partner at the station, hoping to make them smile. A few of them gave the tiniest laughs, weak but real. When the paramedics arrived, the girls were taken to the hospital to be checked for frostbite and malnutrition. James followed behind, staying until he was sure they were safe and warm. Later that night, he learned the truth. The girls were siblings. Their mother had passed away years earlier, and their father had abandoned them. Extended family had refused to take them in, and no one wanted to adopt so many children at once. Child Services planned to split them up into different foster homes across the state. That thought made James's stomach turn. He imagined them being sent to strangers scattered in different towns, losing the only family they had left, each other. He knew that would break them in ways they might never recover from. Sitting in the hospital waiting room that night, James couldn't shake the image of them shivering in the snow, clinging to one another like it was their last hope. He thought about his own childhood, about losing his father, and how his mother had fought to keep him and his sister together. Something inside him told him this wasn't just another case. This was something he was meant to be part of. He didn't know how yet, but deep down, he'd already made up his mind he wasn't going to let these girls be torn apart. What James didn't know was that this moment, this freezing winter night, would change the rest of his life, forever. It would be the beginning of a story that would take 20 years to unfold, a story of love, sacrifice, and a reward so extraordinary it would one day touch the hearts of millions. James couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the howling wind outside matching the storm in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those 6 girls, their thin faces, the way they clung to each other like lifelines, and the trembling in the oldest girl's voice when she said, "They don't want us." By morning, his mind was made up, even though he didn't have a plan. It wasn't a decision based on logic or reason. It was something deeper, a pull in his heart that told him, you can't walk away. He got up early, put on his uniform, and drove straight to the Child Services office. The building was cold and gray, the kind of place that smelled of paperwork and tired coffee. A social worker named Ms. Roberts met him at the front desk. She looked at him with polite curiosity as he explained, I was the officer who found those 6 sisters last night. I want to know what's going to happen to them. Her answer was as cold as the weather outside. They'll be placed in foster care, but not together. There's no family willing to take all 6. We'll have to separate them. James's chest tightened. You can't split them up, he said firmly. They've already lost everything. If they lose each other, that's it. They'll have nothing left. Ms. Roberts sighed, as if she had heard this argument before. Officer Carter, it's not about what we want, it's about what's possible. No one adopts 6 kids at once. It's too much for most people. But James wasn't most people. In that moment, the words came out before he could stop them. Then, I'll do it. I'll take them. The social worker blinked as if she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. All 6. All 6, he repeated, his voice steady. It wasn't an impulsive offer, at least, not in his heart. James had always believed that if you could help, you should. And this wasn't just about helping. This was about saving a family. Of course, it wasn't simple. The next weeks were a blur of background checks, home inspections, financial reviews, and endless forms. Some of his fellow officers thought he was out of his mind. Jimmy, do you know what you're getting into? 6 kids. That's a whole army, one joked. Others warned him about the cost, the stress, and the responsibility. James listened, but didn't change his mind. He wasn't doing this because it was easy. He was doing it because it was right. When he visited the girls in the hospital during the process, they were still wary of him at first. The oldest one, Emily, asked cautiously, "Why are you here?" James smiled gently. "Because I'm not letting you go through this alone. I don't want you to be split up. I want you to come home with me." They exchanged confused glances, as if trying to figure out if this was real. The youngest, little Lily, reached out her tiny hand and touched his. "You mean? Be our dad." Something in James's chest ached in the best way. "If you'll let me," he said softly. One by one, the girls began to trust him. He brought them small gifts, warm coats, stuffed animals, books, not to buy their love, but to show them that someone cared enough to notice what they needed. Slowly, the walls they had built around themselves began to crack. On the day the adoption was finalized, he stood in the courtroom with all 6 girls by his side. They were wearing new clothes he had bought for them, and their hair had been neatly brushed. The judge looked at him with a mix of respect and disbelief. "Officer Carter, are you certain you want to take on this responsibility?" James glanced down at the girls, Emily, Sarah, Grace, Hannah, Sophie, and little Lily, and felt a swell of pride. "I'm not just certain," he said. "I'm honored." The gavel came down with a sharp thud, and just like that, they were a family. The girls ran to him, wrapping their arms around his waist, their laughter echoing in the courtroom. For the first time in a long time, they weren't unwanted. They were loved. They were home. James didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to give these girls the life they deserved, no matter how many sacrifices it required. Life after the adoption was nothing like the movies. There were no perfect mornings with everyone smiling at the breakfast table. No magical moments where all problems disappeared. Instead, James found himself in the middle of a storm of noise, chaos, and endless responsibilities. The first challenge came almost immediately: space. James's small 2-bedroom home was never meant for 7 people. His room became the only private space he had, and even then, one or two little feet would often sneak in at night after a bad dream. The girls shared rooms, 2 or 3 in each, with mattresses pushed against walls and clothes stored in old boxes because there weren't enough dressers. Then came the expenses. His modest police salary had been enough for a single man, but now he was feeding 7 mouths, buying clothes, paying school fees, and covering medical bills. He stopped going out to eat, canceled his cable subscription, and began working extra shifts just to keep the lights on. There were nights when he'd return home so tired that even taking off his boots felt like a chore. But no matter how exhausted he always checked on each girl, kissed their foreheads, and made sure they felt safe. It wasn't just about money. Emotionally, it was a battle. The girls came with scars, not the kind you could see, but the kind that lived deep inside. Emily, the oldest, had learned to act like a parent long before James came along. She didn't trust easily and sometimes clashed with him over decisions. Sarah would hide food in her room, afraid it might run out. Grace refused to speak for weeks, answering only in nods and shrugs. Hannah had nightmares almost every night, waking up screaming. Sophie would burst into tears over the smallest things. And little Lily clung to James's leg whenever he tried to leave for work. James realized he wasn't just a father, he was also a counselor, a teacher, a cook, a nurse, and sometimes even a referee when arguments broke out. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed down so hard that he had to lock himself in the bathroom for a few minutes just to breathe. But for every hard moment, there were small victories that made it all worth it. The first time Grace laughed out loud. The day Sarah stopped hiding food and left her plate on the table without fear. The morning Emily asked him for advice about school instead of making the decision on her own. Slowly, the walls between them began to crumble. James also learned to adapt in ways he never imagined. He became a master at stretching groceries, turning one chicken into 3 meals. He learned to braid hair, sew buttons, and attend school plays even after pulling a 12-hour shift. Every holiday was celebrated, even if it meant homemade decorations and simple meals. Christmas morning wasn't about expensive gifts. It was about the joy in their eyes when they opened something chosen just for them. Some nights, after the girls had gone to bed, James would sit at the kitchen table, bills spread out in front of him, and wonder if he was enough. Was he giving them the life they deserved? Could he heal wounds that had been there for years? But every time doubt crept in, a small voice, sometimes Lily's sleepy goodnight, Daddy or Emily's quiet thanks for dinner, would remind him why he was doing this. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was the hardest thing he had ever done. But James had made a promise to himself and to those 6 little girls. They would never feel unwanted again. And no matter how tired, broke, or overwhelmed he became, he intended to keep that promise for the rest of his life. Time has a way of softening sharp edges. And in James's home, the storm of uncertainty slowly gave way to something warmer. Something like sunlight breaking through after a long winter. The girls, who once kept their distance and lived with guarded hearts, began to see James not just as the cop who rescued us, but as their dad. It didn't happen overnight. Trust is like a fragile seed. It takes time, patience, and care to grow. But little by little, the signs began to show. Grace, who had once been silent as a shadow, started telling him about her day at school. Sarah, who used to hoard bread rolls under her pillow, began helping James pack lunches for everyone. Hannah's nightmares became less frequent, and on the nights she did wake up crying, she would run straight into James's arms instead of hiding under the covers. James found joy in the smallest things. Saturday mornings became their special time, the smell of pancakes filling the kitchen, laughter bouncing off the walls as the girls competed over who could flip the best one. Evenings were often spent on the couch, a jumble of blankets and limbs, watching old movies or playing board games. Emily, the oldest, was the toughest to win over. She had been the protector for so long that letting someone else take that role felt risky. But one rainy afternoon, James found her in the kitchen, struggling to fix the broken strap on her school bag. Without saying much, he took it from her, repaired it, and handed it back. She looked at him for a moment, then muttered, "Thanks, Dad." That was the first time she'd called him that. He didn't react outwardly, but inside, it felt like a door had opened. Family traditions began to form. Every birthday was celebrated, no matter how small the budget. James learned to bake cakes, sometimes lopsided, sometimes burnt at the edges, but always made with love. On Sundays, they had what the girls called Family Walk Day, where they'd explore the park, feed ducks at the pond, and take silly pictures that ended up taped to the fridge. School events became moments of pride. James attended every parent-teacher conference, clapping the loudest at school plays, even if his shift ended just minutes before curtain call. He once drove 2 hours after work just to see Sophie perform a single line in a play. "She's my daughter," he told anyone who asked why he went through so much trouble. "Of course I'm going to be there." The girls started to feel safe enough to dream. They spoke about what they wanted to be: a teacher, a nurse, a vet, an artist. James encouraged each dream, telling them they could be anything they wanted, as long as they worked hard and believed in themselves. He knew what it meant to grow up thinking the world was against you. He wanted them to believe it was full of possibilities instead. There were still challenges, homework arguments, teenage moods, and the occasional slammed door, but James welcomed them. To him, those moments meant the girls felt secure enough to be themselves. They weren't scared little strangers anymore. They were his children, with their own personalities, quirks, and tempers. One night, as James was tucking Lily into bed, she asked in her tiny voice, "Daddy, if you didn't find us that day, where would we be now?" James paused, his throat tight. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said honestly, "but I do know this: I was meant to find you. All of you." As he turned off the light and closed the door, James realized something. The girls thought he had saved them. But in truth, they had saved him too. Years passed in the Carter household, and what began as a rescue on a cold winter night grew into a lifetime of love, laughter, and lessons. Time didn't just move. It carved deep bonds between James and Yunt. The 6 girls he had once found shivering in the snow. The early struggles slowly faded into memories, replaced by milestones that James treasured. Emily, the oldest, went from being a wary, guarded teenager to a confident young woman who earned a scholarship to study law. She had once fought against trusting him, but now she called him almost every day from college, asking for advice or just to hear his voice. "You always know what to say, Dad," she'd tell him. Sarah, who had once hidden food for fear it might disappear, grew into a warm-hearted chef. She loved cooking for the family, often experimenting with recipes until the kitchen smelled like a 5-star restaurant, though she still had a habit of making enough food for an army. Old habits die hard. She'd laugh, and James would smile, remembering how far she had come. Grace, the quiet one, discovered a love for photography. Through her camera lens, she found her voice, capturing the beauty of everyday life. The way sunlight hit the kitchen table in the morning, the way James's hands looked as he fixed a broken chair, the unguarded laughter of her sisters. Her photos ended up winning contests, and one of her favorite shots, a picture of James reading to little Lily, hung proudly in the living room. Hannah, the one who used to wake up screaming from nightmares, grew into a calm, nurturing soul. She became a nurse, saying she wanted to help people feel safe, the same way James had made her feel. Whenever she was home, she checked on everyone like a second mother, making sure they were eating right and taking care of themselves. Sophie, who once cried at the smallest things, found her strength in music. She learned guitar and started writing songs that told their family's story in melodies and lyrics. James would often sit in the living room, eyes closed, listening to her sing about love, loss, and hope. "You're telling our story, Sophie?" he would say, his voice thick with pride. And little Lily, the baby of the family, grew into a bright, determined young woman with a heart as big as her dreams. She studied education, saying she wanted to work with children who had hard starts in life. "Because if someone hadn't believed in me, I wouldn't be here," she'd say. Through all these years, James was there for every graduation, every award ceremony, every heartbreak, and every triumph. He worked long hours, but never missed the important moments. Sometimes he arrived in his police uniform, fresh off a shift, still smelling faintly of the station. But the girls didn't care. To them, his presence mattered more than anything. Holidays were the heart of their family life, no matter where they were. Everyone came home for Christmas. The house would be filled with laughter, music, and the smell of Sarah's cooking. James would sit in his old armchair, watching his daughters, now grown women, filling the house with the same joy they had once been afraid to believe in. But while the years were filled with love, they were not without sacrifice. James never remarried. He put the girls first in everything, sometimes choosing their needs over his own comfort or dreams. He never complained, though. To him, raising them was not a burden, but a privilege. What James didn't know was that the girls noticed every sacrifice, every overtime shift, every worn-out pair of shoes he didn't replace, every time he skipped buying something for himself, so they could have what they needed. And as they built their own lives, they carried a quiet promise in their hearts. One day, they would find a way to give back to the man who had given them everything. That promise became the seed of a plan. A plan that would take years of saving, secret conversations, and determination. And when the time came, the surprise they had in store would be so incredible that it would bring James to his knees. The day started like any other for James Carter, or at least, that's what he thought. It was his retirement day, after more than 3 decades of service as a police officer. And although he knew there would be a small ceremony at the station, he expected nothing more than a handshake, a plaque, and maybe a slice of cake from the break room. But his 6 daughters had been planning something for years. Quietly, patiently, in secret, the morning air was crisp as James dressed in his neatly pressed uniform for the last time. He paused in front of the mirror, straightening his badge. The same one he had worn through countless nights of patrol, rescues, and arrests. It was more than just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of his life's work. Still, he felt a strange emptiness knowing he was about to hang it up for good. When he arrived at the station, the parking lot was unusually full. Inside, the place buzzed with energy. Officers, town officials, and even people he hadn't seen in years were gathered in the lobby. Old partners slapped him on the back, and younger officers shook his hand with admiration. The chief gave a heartfelt speech, talking about James's dedication, bravery, and compassion. Not just as a cop, but as a man who had changed lives. After the applause faded, Emily stepped forward, holding a microphone. She looked poised, but her eyes shimmered with emotion. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling, "you've given us 20 years of love, protection, and sacrifice. You worked long hours, went without, and put our dreams before your own. You never asked for anything in return. But today, we want to give you something back." James frowned slightly, confused. The girls exchanged excited glances. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "You always dreamed of having a place where you could relax, fish in the mornings, and watch the sunset in peace," she said. "We remember every little thing you ever told us." Grace stepped forward next, handing him the envelope. James hesitated before opening it, his hands trembling. Inside was a set of keys, shiny, brand new. He blinked, unsure what he was. "Looking at Dad," Sophie said softly. Stepping closer, "We bought you a house." For a moment, the room fell silent. James stared at the keys, then at his daughters, then back at the keys. "You? What?" he whispered, as though saying it out loud might make it more real. "It's all yours," Hannah said, smiling through tears. "No mortgage, no rent. Just a home where you can finally rest." Lily, the youngest, stepped forward and hugged him tightly. "We saved for years, Dad. Every bonus, every extra shift we took, every little bit we could spare, all so we could do this for you. You gave us a life, so we wanted to give you the life you deserve." The realization hit him all. At once, the years of them whispering to each other at family gatherings. The quiet moments when they seemed to be planning something behind his back. It had all been for this. His legs went weak, and for the first time in decades, James felt tears run freely down his face. "I don't deserve this," he choked out. "Yes, you do," Emily said firmly, her voice breaking. "More than anyone." We know when they showed him pictures of the house, a cozy place near a lake, with a porch big enough for rocking chairs and sunsets. James knew this was more than just a gift. It was a symbol. A symbol that every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every hard choice he had made had been worth it. The applause in the room faded into the background as his daughters surrounded him in a group hug. In that moment, James realized something profound. They had once been 6 unwanted girls, but now they were 6 strong women who carried his love in their hearts. And they had just given him the greatest gift of his life. The sun was dipping low in the sky when James Carter stepped onto the wooden porch of his new home for the very first time. The boards creaked softly beneath his boots, and the air smelled faintly of pine and the crisp freshness that only came from being near the lake. Out in the distance, the water shimmered in shades of gold and orange, reflecting the fading light like liquid fire. He had spent years imagining a moment like this. A quiet place to breathe. A place where the weight of duty and the long nights of sirens and danger no longer pressed on his shoulders. But he had never dared to believe it would actually happen. Behind him, the laughter of his daughters filled the air. They were running through the house like excited children, opening drawers, peeking into rooms, claiming corners for holiday decorations. Sarah was already talking about the best spot for a grill, while Sophie insisted on finding the perfect corner for her guitar. Grace wandered out with her camera, capturing the moment in soft, glowing frames. James leaned against the porch railing, closing his eyes for a moment as the cool evening breeze brushed his face. 20 years ago, he had walked into an abandoned building and found 6 cold, frightened girls who had no one. Today, those same girls had given him a home, not just a house of wood and brick, but a living, breathing reminder that love, once given, has a way of returning in ways you could never imagine. As the evening wore on, they all gathered around the dining table, the first meal in the new home. Emily raised her glass of sweet tea and said, "To Dad, for showing us what love really means. And to this home, a place where we'll always come back, no matter how far we go." James couldn't speak for a moment. His throat was tight, and his eyes shimmered with tears he didn't try to hide. "You girls think you're thanking me," he said finally. "But the truth is, you've been my greatest blessing. You've saved me just as much as I saved you." Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, James stepped outside once more. The lake was still, the stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. He sat in a rocking chair on the porch, listening to the quiet, a quiet he had earned. Somewhere deep inside, he knew their story wasn't over. There would be more gatherings, more laughter, more photos taken on this porch. But for now, he simply let himself feel the peace that had been missing for so long. And as the night wrapped itself around the house, James realized that the word unbelievable didn't even begin to describe it. This this love, this family. This life was more than he had ever dreamed. The man who once walked alone now had 6 strong, beautiful women by his side, and a home filled with the warmth of every memory they had built together. And in that moment, he knew no act of kindness is ever wasted, and sometimes the rewards don't just come back to you, they come back multiplied. Wrapped in love and waiting at your doorstep. Months passed since James moved into his new home, but the feeling of gratitude still followed him like a warm shadow. Every morning, he woke up to the soft sound of birds by the lake and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Some days it was Sarah making breakfast. Other days it was Lily, who had taken to visiting him every weekend. The house had quickly transformed into a living scrapbook of their lives. The walls were dotted with Grace's framed photographs. Candid shots of the girls laughing on the porch. James sitting by the fireplace with a mug in his hand. Sunsets melting into the lake's horizon. Sophie's guitar often rested against the wall near the couch, ready for impromptu sing-alongs during family visits. The fridge was covered in postcards from the girls whenever they traveled for work or studies, proof that no matter how far they went, they always carried a piece of home with them. James's retirement didn't mean slowing down completely. He volunteered at the local youth center, mentoring troubled kids. Many of them came from broken homes, their eyes carrying the same wariness he had once seen in his daughters. He didn't just talk to them, he listened, sharing bits of his own story, hoping to plant seeds of hope. You might not believe it now, he would tell them, but the right people can change your whole life. The girls often joined him in his volunteer work. Hannah gave free health checkups at the center. Emily offered legal advice to families in need. Sarah cooked meals for community events. Grace documented the stories of those who had overcome hardship, while Sophie played music to bring joy to the gatherings. Even Lily, with her passion for teaching, started a small after-school reading program for kids who were falling behind. The Carter's family had become more than a family. They had become a movement. People in town began calling them the family of second chances. Their story spread far beyond the borders of their small community. Local newspapers wrote about them. Then national outlets picked it up, and soon, James and his daughters were being invited to speak at events about the power of love, resilience, and choosing to help, even when it's not easy. At first, James resisted the attention. He didn't see himself as a hero, but every time he looked at his daughter standing beside him, he realized the story wasn't just his. It belonged to all of them. And telling it meant giving hope to people who had almost given up. One evening, after a long day of speaking at a charity event, James and the girls sat around a bonfire in the backyard. The lake reflected the moonlight, and the air was filled with the smell of wood smoke. Emily leaned back in her chair and said, "You know, Dad, we used to think you saved us. But I think now we saved each other." James smiled, his heart full. "Maybe that's the thing about family," he replied. "You're not keeping score. You're just loving each other the best you can." As the fire crackled and the night wrapped around them, James realized that their story didn't end with a rescue or a house. It was still being written. Every laugh, every hug, every time they showed up for one another was another chapter. And perhaps that was the most unbelievable part of all. Not the moment he found them in the cold, not even the dream home they gave him years later, but the fact that against all odds, they had built a life so full of love that it could light the path for others who were lost in the dark. Years had passed, and the seasons had turned many times over the lake outside James Carter's home. His once young daughters were now women in their 40s, with families of their own. The house that had been his peaceful retreat had transformed into the family's anchor, a place where holidays, birthdays, and Sunday dinners still brought everyone together. The porch railing bore the marks of time, softened by countless hands resting on it during long conversations. The rocking chairs had heard hundreds of stories, laughter, and even quiet tears. The old wooden table inside had hosted so many meals that its surface had become a tapestry of tiny scratches and stains, each one a memory. James was older now. His hair had turned silver, his walk had slowed, but his eyes still carried the same warmth they had the day he first told 6 scared little girls, "You're safe now." His daughters never let him feel alone. One of them was always around, bringing groceries, helping with chores, or simply sitting with him on the porch as the sun went down. But the real proof of their bond came in the next generation. James's grandchildren, a mix of Emily's tall, thoughtful boy, Sarah's twin girls with mischievous grins, Grace's shy little daughter who loved drawing, Hannah's big-hearted son who always hugged first, Sophie's curious little boy with a love for music, and Lily's adopted daughter, bright-eyed and full of life, all knew the story by heart. They knew that Grandpa James had once been a police officer who found their mothers huddled in the cold. They knew he had chosen to take them all in, not because it was easy, but because it was right. And they knew that every holiday gathering, every family photo, every bit of love they felt in that home existed because of that one choice. One summer afternoon, during a family reunion, Emily's son asked James, "Grandpa, why did you do it? Why take all of them at once?" James chuckled, his voice soft but steady. "Because I could. Because they needed someone, and I was there." Sometimes that's all it takes, just showing up when you're needed most. The words stayed with the boy, and years later, when he became a firefighter, he would tell his crew about his grandfather, the man who taught him that courage wasn't just about running into burning buildings, but about standing by people when no one else would. By the time James reached his late 80s, the family had grown so large that gatherings overflowed into the yard. Chairs and picnic blankets dotted the grass, children played by the lake, and laughter filled the air. James would sit in his rocking chair, watching it all, the sound of their voices blending into a melody that wrapped around him like a warm blanket. On his 90th birthday, the family threw him a surprise celebration. They made a giant display of photographs spanning decades, the day of the adoption, first days of school, graduations, weddings, and the moment when his daughters had handed him the keys to his home. As he looked at the pictures, James realized his life had been measured not by years, but by love. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he stood slowly, leaning on his cane, and looked out at the sea of faces. Children, grandchildren, friends, neighbors, all the lives his choice had touched. "You know," he said, his voice breaking but strong enough to carry, "people always called what I did unbelievable. But to me, the real miracle is this, the love we've built here. Together, this is my reward." The applause, the cheers, the tears, they all washed over him. But what mattered most was knowing that when he was gone, the story wouldn't end. His daughters and their children after them would carry it forward. A story of compassion, courage, and the belief that no one is ever truly unwanted. And as night fell over the lake, James sat back in his chair, content. He had lived a life full of meaning. He had planted seeds of kindness that would keep growing long after he was gone. And in the quiet, he whispered to himself, "We saved each other